Hello, my name is Justin Ruger. I am the host of Accessible Beekeeping and More. Today we have our co-host Jonathan and our special guest Dwayne Parkinson. How are you doing, Jonathan?
Doing well.
And yourself, Dwayne?
I'm fantastic. Thank you.
We are extremely excited to hear about your new hive. It's not like anything that we've ever seen before. We had Christy Hemingway on last night, and she talked about her specific design for Top Bar. So this is a perfect follow up for a new type of hive that may be able to help people with disabilities. And I hope as we get further along, you'll be able to tell us some of those things.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting. Yeah, you had Christy Hemingway. That's pretty big shoes to follow. That's she's a heavyweight.
Yeah, she knows a lot more than I do.
Yep. Um,
So to start, we just wanted to know how long have you been beekeeping? How did you get into bees? What your favorite part of beekeeping is? Just a kind of general overview of you and beekeeping.
yeah. So, well, first off, congrats on your book. I don't know if anybody says that, but congratulations on your book. That's
Thank you
cool
so
that you got
much.
that published. Yeah, that's really nice. Um, as for me, I'm not a beekeeper. I mean, I play one on TV, um, and I don't know what the qualification of beekeeper is, but um, how I got started was an accident, really, and boring. But so I went to a church, and um, you know they needed somebody to mow the lawn. So it was a riding lawnmower, and it only steered to the left. It didn't steer to the right. So there I was, turning circles in the churchyard, mowing ever bigger circles. And like the day before, somebody come in and talked about some some missions thing, which is giving money to some charity. Like right now, part of the missions is helping people out of Ukraine, for instance, right? So there's missions like that go on. And they talked about how much money is given through missions, and it broke down through different denominations and things like that. And this particular church and this particular denomination ranked highest out of all denominations, and it worked out to $7 per adult per year. And I thought, wow, that's not a ton. And it wouldn't take much to actually double that. And I was just, randomly thinking that as I'm mowing around in circles. And then all of a sudden, a group of bees flew past me, and they went into this little shed. And I thought, well, that's weird. I don't think I've ever seen a group of bees like that. And I thought, well, maybe it's a swarm. That's as much as I knew about bees. It wasn't. It was just a group of yellow jackets. But anyway, that got me thinking. Um, if if somebody just sold a jar of honey for $7, you double, the annual giving of somebody to help out these things. And a lot of churches have this. We'll call them the population of people who go there who are retired, and they don't have a ton to do, right? They're looking for things to do. But they're retired. And so I thought, well, maybe if a couple people were interested in keeping bees, they could sell a couple jars of honey and, basically double the missions giving. So that was the random thought that went into my head as I was mowing the lawn at the church. Then I followed up and I looked at beekeeping, and I imagine 78-year-old Gladys trying to lift a 50-pound super of honey off a Langstroth hive, and I'm like, that is not going to work at all. Fail right off the bat. And I thought that can't be how this actually works. And I looked into it, and sure enough, it is. And I thought, geez, so the people who could do beekeeping actually have to be pretty fit, have good physical dexterity, because you're constantly prying these bars around and lifting, and it's not something for the people who have limited physical capabilities. A little more research, and I found top bars, and the top bar hive, which is the horizontal hive. And like most people, when they encounter this, I thought all horizontal hives were top bar hives. And for the people listening, from a bee's perspective, there are only three three options for inside a hive. You have a top bar, and then the comb kind of hang. I can't do this; it's backwards. The top bar and the comb kind of hangs down. Oh man, that's hard. Hangs down from a stick of wood, right? And then there's another one which is a full frame, just a rectangle, which is set in the hive, and then the comb gets built on the rectangle. And then there's a third option, which is kind of a combination, which is a cathedral. It's half of a hexagon, right?
Mm.
And so it's got a top, and then it's got kind of sides. And so those are the three options. But I thought that all horizontal hives were top bars. And the traditional hives that everybody's used to seeing, those stacked white boxes, are, you know, Langstroths, and those are all frames. And as I went through it, I discovered that that's not true at all. And so I learned about Warre hives. I read all of Warre's stuff. He was a guy back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was doing a bunch of experiments with hives. And so I got really interested in the experiments that he was doing, the experiments that other people were doing. And there was this golden era of beekeeping where there were all these experiments with all kinds of shapes and sizes of hives, the leaf hive and the Warre, and they had what they called the long hives, which we'll talk about. And I had their names like Duvachel, Vournay, Dedant, Layens, Jerry, Congress, all those early people who had different hives, and they all had their theories and what they were trying to do. It was so interesting to read about it. So I really took a year to just read up on hives and understand what they were doing and why. And so I just kind of immersed myself that way and started thinking about hive design in the effort or the idea of how can I make this more accessible, right? Because, you know, this is a podcast about accessible beekeeping, and what's really happening for everybody is we get less physical dexterity as we age. And some people start out with more and get less. Some people start out with less and then get less as they age too. So everybody's on a decline. And you start out with, you know, on one side of the spectrum, you have the Olympic gymnast. And then, you know, over here is somebody who has very limited mobility. And I wanted to provide something for people who didn't have a lot of, I don't know what's the best word for it, but a lot of strength, a lot of consistent, reliable dexterity. You know, like if you lift something and you get a twinge in your back, you got to be able to drop it. And if you got a box full of bees, you can't drop that. You know what I mean?
No.
So there are some challenges there. And you had a guest on, I think, a week or two ago from Australia who had that challenge where I think it was some neurological issue where she had to be careful because she would drop things, right?
Yes.
So thinking about those types of things, I eventually came to the conclusion that, you know what, this, rather than stacked boxes and lifting those boxes, that's not going to work. So let's go with a longer orientation. And I thought, well, that's a top bar hive. And then I learned about, well, you don't have to use those sticks with the comb hanging down, whichever way that goes. Boy, that's hard. Comb hanging down. You don't have to use that, because as you do a top bar hive, that's kind of the upper echelon of beekeeping in my eyes, is a top bar hive, because you have to really know what you're doing. You have to manage that space really well. You have to be very careful with the comb, and nothing wrong with top bar beekeeping, but you got to want it, you know? And the idea of having that where it slips out of your hand is, you know, just a mess. It's just a mess. So that's why I kind of tended toward this long Langstroth idea, where you use Langstroth frames, which are the square frames, and you just put them in a box. However, the other part of that is that I live in northern Wisconsin, and our growing zone is 3B, for anybody that wants to look that up, which is basically way too cold for continental United States, but it's one of the coldest places in the lower US here. And so those hives tend to die. They don't make it through, and there's a lot of theories on why, but just a little bit of research and a little bit of testing showed why. And so what I did is I tried to understand the bee cycle, and the bee cycle You know, you have a bee lives its life, and then the colony has a cycle, and that operates within the year. And the bee cycle is that, you know, we'll start in the winter or in late fall. They stop gathering honey, they kick the drones out, and then they cluster up, right? And I'm going to do my little example here. They cluster up, and we'll just say that this is the size of the cluster. As it gets colder, that cluster shrinks. They get closer together. And as it gets really cold, they only move in one direction, and that's up, right? And so if your frame is this high, I'll get this camera thing figured out. Your frame is this high, and you have a cluster this big, and it's really cold for a week, they can move up and there'll be food. They're moving up because they're consuming honey to heat the cluster. And they can move up, but then they'll reach the top of that frame. They won't move side to side because it's too cold. When it warms up, what they'll do is they'll spread out a little bit, find new honey, and recluster around that honey. Now, they will move side to side, and one of the challenges of horizontal hive is they spread out like this. They don't know which way to go. Do they go to the left, or sorry, to the right, I guess, by the screen, or to the left? So they don't know. In nature, what happens is they just move up, right? But they've already got to the top, so they have to decide left or right. And sometimes what happens in those horizontal hives is they pick the wrong direction. And they go this way, and the honey is over here, right? And so then they die in the hive with the honey right next to them over here because they don't go back the other direction. And the other thing that happens in that horizontal hive, and boy, people debate me on this all the time online, and you know how the online world, they descend into these arguments, but the bees are in this cluster and it's warm. They heat the cluster. There was a study from some university that says they heat the cluster, they don't heat the hive. So they're heating the cluster. Their warm bee breath goes up. The exhaust breath goes up. And there's a function for that. It's actually warming the cappings over the honey so that they have an easier time as they move up to remove the cappings. Anyway, but it goes up and it condenses somewhere, right? And there's a scientific formula for how that condensation happens and where it happens. Now, as you have your cluster here and you have your, hive or your frame that's about this high, and then there's some insulation on top of it, and then it's -40 right here, right? So it's -40 right here, and the bees are alive right here. You have a very short space for that heat to dissipate, and what happens is, what you've heard of the dew point when you watch the weather, right? The dew point at which dew condenses. That dew point moves inside the hive, right? And as it warms up, it moves back outside the hive, and so the insulation on the top of your horizontal hive is really important because it controls where that dew point is. Once the dew point moves in the hive, which you can't, once it gets really cold, it's going to move inside the hive. Then what you have is your cluster and a cloud. Think of it that way. A cloud of fog right above it, condensing and dripping right back down through your cluster, right? So now they're getting dripped on and it's killing them. So what happens is sometimes in the extreme cold, they basically get rained on and they die in the middle of the winter. So you've got those two things that you're battling. You're trying to convince the bees to go toward the honey, wherever that is, and you're trying to control that cloud that forms over the bees, right? So that's what I was battling, is if I do a horizontal hive, the value of that horizontal hive is that anybody with reasonable dexterity can pick up a single frame, right? Instead of lifting a whole box. And that's single frame by single frame inspection, and pulling one single frame for honey meant that it was available to a lot more people. Then if you control those two variables, you've got a hive that can survive where I live. So that led me to the hive design. And as I was thinking about it, I just threw everything out and said, okay, let's just start with what we're going to start with, this square frame, right? And I know that the bees are going to be on there, and that's all I know. I don't know what else it is. And so what I did is I created a thing called a frame holder to go around it. And then I working sideways, I put one frame holder here, the next frame holder here, the next frame holder here, so it's stair stepped up. And what that did is when that cluster of bees is here and they have that warm exhaust air, it floats up and then it condenses as it floats away and drips down away from them. So you still have the moisture in the hive, which they need, but it's condensing away from the cluster. The other thing is that the bees have a sense of up. So when they're in their cluster and they go up and they reach the top of the frame, they go, oh, there's another frame right over here that's a little bit higher. They move up. And then there's another frame over here. They move up. So it gives them a sense of up to follow. And so in the question of how long have I been doing this, it's been about 6 years now. This will be 6 years. And they've always done exactly what I expected them to do. And there were a lot of tests, and I have a lot of videos on the Facebook group and stuff like that of early tests and failures and things like that. You'll see all kinds of failures out there, right? So this is not me being brilliant at the beginning. This is me failing over 6 years. And eventually you run out of things that don't work. That's basically all this is. So I created that hive where it stair steps up, and it works really well. And, you know, full disclosure, it's fidgety, you know, because you have these individual frame holders and you move them and do things like that. So it works great. And for somebody like me who, you know, I've got good dexterity, I can move and I can lift and do things like that, it works great. For people with trouble lifting things or bending, it also works great, you know, because you're not lifting a box full of honey or anything like that. So that's how I kind of came across that hive, is I just threw everything out and said, well, let's just start with a frame and try to give them some sense of up and some way to ventilate and move that moisture. And through trial and error over the course of 6 years, that's how it came to be. So how's that for a long intro?
That's perfect. So you've been doing it for 6 years.
Yeah.
And why do you not qualify yourself as a beekeeper?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I'm not, I guess it depends on your goal, you know, because if my goal is to reinvigorate that creative, what do the bees need? Is there a better hive? Because if you think about it, those names that I gave you, the Duvachel and Warnay and Dadant and Layens and Jerry and Congress, most people have never heard of them. They've only heard of Langstroth, right? Most people have never even heard of Warray. But Warray was the last one. And the reason he's so important is he was kind of the last one in the experimental hive, the hive experimenters in that lineage. Because after that, people said, well, we'll just use Langstroth, right? Well, for the most part, there's Standard and National and a couple others floating around. But basically, people threw up their hand and said, we're going to use Langstroth. And that was driven from the commercial market, right? Because the commercial beekeepers really rule the world of beekeeping. And they're box swappers, right? So we're going to slap down a box, and then we're going to come back. We're going to slap down another box. We're going to slap on another box, and we've got a truckload of boxes, boom, boom, boom. And then in the fall, we're going to load those boxes on pallets just to put them on a semi and ship them out, right? And their methods, their beekeeping methods, they've been doing the same things for 20 or 30 years. But when you talk about what is a beekeeper, they're the ones that are beekeepers, if you want to call it that, in my mind. So I'm an experimenter. I'm I guess a backyard beekeeper, if that's the right word for it.
So you're a hobbyist.
Yeah, there you go. That's the right word. I'm a hobbyist, focusing more on hives than honey. A lot of people are hobbyists for their garden, right? They have just one hive or two to pollinate their garden, and they get some honey out of it. They sell at the farmer's market or whatever. And I'm strictly a hobbyist, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And really, like I said, there was that initial thing, and then I wanted something. We live sort of in the country, and I wanted something where my kids could see where food comes from other than the store. And so we have a little garden, and we're not going to raise chickens or anything like that. But I have a picture of my then 5-year-old or 6-year-old on that Parkinson Hive, you know, putting a frame in. And so you can't do that. You can't have a 6-year-old participate in Langstroth beekeeping. You know what I mean? That other than just saying, here, hand me a frame or something like that. They can't slap a box on top. They can't do anything really. But here they can do the whole process. And that's true of everybody. So yeah, I don't consider myself a traditional beekeeper by any stretch. You know, I'm not in it for the honey or the money or anything like that, which is why all the plans are available online. Everything I do, I show all the pictures and stuff like that.
Speaking of honey, does your so people were wondering about if people were wondering about weight. Each frame of honey is roughly around 7 to 8 pounds, and then a full box can be anywhere from 70 to 80 pounds of honey. How do the bees produce honey in your hive? Do you
Yeah,
still get, because in a Langstroth hive you put a super on there and you get 10 dedicated to 8 or 10 dedicated frames to honey. You are not looking for honey production, so it wasn't the first thought in your mind. But
right.
if somebody were interested in honey production, how does your hive produce?
Yeah, it produces well. And one of the tricks is that you have to, if you come into it with a Langstroth background, you completely throw that away. You don't want that polluting your thoughts, because what happens is the bees. Oh my gosh, I'm going to make a statement that has got me in trouble on the internet more than any other statement. Ready? Here it is. A radical thing. Bees build from the top down 100% of the time. And beekeepers will fight with me and fight with me and fight with me because when they're doing their Langstroth stuff, they put their boxes on top. So therefore, since they put their boxes on top, clearly the bees build from the bottom up. That's not true at all. So I'll get back to that. But in nature, that honeybee cycle, bees crawl up to the top of the cavity, wherever it is, and they start building, right? They start building their way down, and they make a spot, and the queen starts laying a couple of eggs, and the honey goes above the, gosh darn it, the honey goes above the eggs. This is really hard, guys. Honey goes above the eggs, and then usually, you know, the pollen is off to the sides, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they just keep building, and they build the brood down, and the honey keeps going up, and the brood down, and the honey keeps going up, and the brood down, and the honey keeps going on top of the brood, and eventually you get to a size of brood chamber where the queen is only able to lay a certain number of cells or a certain number of eggs per day. And so that brood chamber reaches a maximum size, and she's just doing circles in that brood chamber all day long, and the honey just keeps getting stored up above. And as more honey comes in, the wax building bees are going down on the bottom, right? And so the hive is growing from the top all the way down in nature. Then in the winter, they stop doing that and they consume the honey on their way up, right? Through the winter. And then summer starts and it all starts all over again. And then because they already had a start from the last time, they have some, in theory, stored honey from last time, then they can, you know, do their swarm and stuff like that. We're not going to get into that. But they build from the top down. So my hive, gosh, my hive is at an angle. One and then another, and then another, oops, and then another. So it's stair steps, right? So what happens is they start at the top, wherever the top is, the top of my stairs, and they fill that frame, and then they go to the next one, and they go to the next one, and they go to the next one. And just like in nature, what happens is that the brood chamber is constantly moving down. Now, one of the things about my hive is that there's an inspection window on the front, which is really cool because you can look up into the hive and do an inspection. You see the bees going up there and you can see what's going on. When they get close to the front, you always want a few frames open, and you add a few frames to the front and push the rest of the frames up. Sorry, push the rest of the frames up. Yes. So what happens then is the honey naturally floats to the top, right? So all you do to harvest honey is grab the frames off the top, and they're not even there. You know that once you get honey on those frames, the bees kind of leave them alone and they tend to go back down. So as you get frames of honey wherever the top is, this is harder than I expected it to be. You get frames of honey at the top, and then it comes down, and then you'll get a frame where it's honey and brood. There's almost always one that's got honey on one side, brood on the other, right? And that's your natural barrier. The queen won't go past that 99.999% of the time, because why would she? Right? She's busy going in that circle over here with the brood. Now the cool thing is that since the brood is always at the bottom of the hive, I've got that inspection window. You can see you can see a laying queen down there. You can see the eggs. You can see everything about it. You don't have to smoke it or go in or anything. You can. And my kids go up there and open the door and look and say, yeah, they can see everything. And so you do that in the evening without a suit or anything. So it makes it for great inspections. But in terms of honey, what happens is that honey floats to the top. And as the season progresses, you manage your hive in two sections. You have the brood section down at the bottom and the honey section up at the top. And so you're adding frames in both sections. And eventually the brood section gets to be the size that the queen needs. And now this is an important thing. Remember I said all those early hive designers, Wari and Dedant and all those folks? One of the things that they were doing, in fact, the thing that they were doing, was trying to figure out how big to make the brood chamber before you slap the honey on top, right? And so the idea was that if you have a box this big, then that's the size of the brood chamber, and then you slap the honey chamber on top, and so, or the honey super on top. So you'd have one brood chamber, not two, one. And then the bees would live in there, and once that's full, they have enough room for the brood, and then you slap the honey super on. And then, design number 2 would say, no, that doesn't work. You need a bigger box on the bottom and a super on top. And then design number 3 would come along and say, no, you need a smaller one. And of course, they all lived in different climates, right, with different genetics. So no two queens, no two hives are going to have the exact same brood chamber size. So that's kind of the fallacy of that, differences between, if you think about the difference between National, Standard, Dedant, Langstroth, all those, it's just size, right? It's the size of the hive. And like Wari, his is very small because he found that in the winter that did a lot better. The bees overwintered a lot better than in a bigger box. Well, he lived a little farther north than some of those other folks, right? So he had to deal with that. So when it comes to managing your hive and you say, okay, I've got my brood chamber, it could be 6 frames, it could be 12 frames. Don't know. The queen determines that. And so the beauty of this is that there is no fixed brood chamber. It's whatever your queen in your area needs. And then you've got the honey super, or the honey supers, which is just more frames up above. And so as you get to the edge of that divider line there, and I always keep the entrance right on that divider, that frame that has honey on one side and brood on the other, so that the bees coming in can decide which way they're going. If they're providing resources for, if they're bringing in pollen for the brood, or if they're bringing in honey or nectar, right, they can go over to the honey. And then I just add a frame right on the other side. So there's always an open frame right on the other side of the door. And that makes their trip in and out really short, right? So the honey is just in and out, in and out, in and out. So when there's a flow on, it fills up really quickly, right? So it seems to work pretty well. We have a pretty short season up here, a very short season. And so you can get honey out of it. I don't have like a direct comparison because I don't have like 10 Langstroth hives or anything like that, to measure 10 of those versus 10 of these and do averages. Like I said in some comment, if Bill Gates wants to fund me, I'm happy to try. I don't know that number, but since we're using deeps, if I compare those and say, well, it's about 1 deep frame, or if you get 10 deep frames, it's about 10, or a double super, right? Completely full. And so I get more than that, right, in northern Wisconsin. So that's doing okay, I think.
So how many frames are in your hive?
I'm sorry, what?
How many frames is in your hive, or can it hold all together?
Yeah, it depends how long you make it. I think the one that I have does 35 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is standard for top bar hive. It's usually around 35 to 40 frames.
Yeah, and that's because you just take 8-foot 2x6 and cut it in half, and that's what the math works out to. But the other thing about this, and one of the things, if you ask what have I done with honey, in mine, I'm using flow frames. So the other thing about this is, remember I said that there's top bars. You can put a top bar in here, and it's a top bar hive. And the nice thing is, it's a much better top bar hive than any other top bar hive. And the reason is because that top bar goes across and goes onto the frame holder, right? Now, with the traditional top bar hives, the Kenyan top bar hives, they have those slanted sides at 22.5 degrees, right?
Mhm.
Which is the angle of a honeycomb. And the reason they do that is because it helps reduce the sticking. And Christy Hemingway probably talked to you about that, right? That if you put the angle of those sides at the same as a honeycomb, they won't stick the honeycomb to the side of the hive as much. They'll still stick it to the side of the hive, but then that allows you to take that top bar out without it sticking to the side and coming unattached and all that stuff. Well, the top bar goes into the frame holders. Frame holders come out of the hive, and so it doesn't matter if they stick or not, right? Because basically that becomes your frame then, and you can still pull it out, you can inspect it, put it back in, and when it comes time to harvest, you just literally just pry the sides off, and there's your honey on the top bar. So it's a much better top bar than a top bar, because top bars are fidgety and fussy, and if you've ever had one with comb collapses into the bottom and you're digging in there trying to get that out with bees crawling up your arms, that's not a fun experience for anybody. So it's a lot better, in my estimation, is a lot better than that. And the other thing is that you can then, because the hive is comprised of a series of frame holders interconnected, and the frame holder holds a Langstroth frame, a top bar, or a flow frame, right? So what I've done is put flow frames in there, and one of the things that I've discovered is, man, if you give them anything other than a flow frame, they'll take it. Flow frame is their last resort, and I've had to run them out of room completely and spray down that flow frame before they'll take a flow frame. So while they do use flow frames, they don't like flow frames from my experience. There's nothing wrong with flow frames, or the flow frame hive or any of that. It's it's just a different honey extracting mechanism. But I use that, and then I can just because it comes off, the honey comes off one frame at a time. If you want, I just pull it off and drain it out. Super easy. So that's how I've gotten some honey that I got to get out this year. But
talking about your design, so from some of the pictures, it looked like the flames are hanging there.
Right.
That do not have a box around them, or
Not at all.
So they're just free hanging.
Well, they have a box around them. The frame holder is the box around them. And so the way to think about this is, you've got a frame holder which has sides and a bottom, and then your frame goes in there. So your frame is inside of some sides and a bottom, and then there's a top piece that goes on, which is your inner cover, if you want to think of it that. So each frame holder consists of a top, sides, and bottom that interlock. And because the frame holders interlock, when you put 10 of them together, you've got yourself a box, right? And the box size grows or shrinks as you need. And so it's really just stealing that. There was one sentence in Wari's book that really stuck with me, which was, he wanted his hive to simulate an ever-growing hollow tree, right? And that's really what he was after. And the thing that he does that's different is, the Wari, you stack boxes. Langstroth, you flop them on top. He says, nope, lift up the whole hive and slide another one underneath it. And those Wari guys, they do that. They have special lifts and handles and stuff to make that happen. But geez, I can't imagine having 4 of those boxes or having them tip over or something like that. That would be pretty tough. But yeah, the idea is basically a ripoff of him. Instead of a ever-growing vertical tree, it's an ever-growing, hollow log stuck at an angle, right? And so the frame holders interlock. So each side has a kind of an outer and an inner like this. And there's just a little gap like that. And then they just slide together with, and interlock so that you don't have, they're offset. Sorry, they're offset like that too, so that the breeze can't
Okay.
blow straight through, right? So there's always the ability to stop that. So you don't have that breeze issue, and they're interlocking, so they move together as a set if you want them to. They slide up and down. But yeah, there's no box. It's really comprised of a stand, which holds the frame holders, and that stand can be raised, to any height or elevation you want. And so if you have, for instance, somebody in a wheelchair, right, they can have that stand be very low to the ground, and the bees don't care, right, and they'll be able to maintain the whole thing without a problem. So it stair steps up and interlocks, and there is that stand provides the rigidity for the hive, and then the frame holders are all floppy. They're just 3 pieces, well, 5 pieces of wood, but it comes down to 3 pieces that are held together with straps, like those like 1-inch vinyl straps, that's like a
Yeah.
ratchet strap material. Yeah, they're held together with that. So like when you're not using them, you don't have this giant corner of your garage occupied with empty boxes, right? They fold up and they're stored in a little tote. So it's very easy to compress them down and move them around. They're very light, and then you just unfold them and slide them in, and magically your hive is expanded. So yeah, there's no box in that one.
You say that they're easy to build. So you have the plans online, correct?
Yeah.
And what would you say the cost to build your hive is?
Oh shoot.
An average cost.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a materials list in there, and I will say that it's more cutting. You make a lot more cuts. You're making a lot of little parts. So it's basically, the stand is 2 2x4s and a 2x6, 3 2x4s and a 2x6. So whatever that costs. And the lid is, a sheet of plywood, or quarter sheet of plywood or a third sheet of plywood, and then there's some of that, and then the frame holders, they're 2x4s cut up, and 2x4s and 1x4s cut up, and so to make 35 of those, I think it was like 4 2x4s and 5 1x4s or something like that. So it's whatever the price of lumber is. The main
Which
thing
nowadays.
yeah. Yeah, and the other part of that is that, well, I'm saying 1x4s and 2x4s. If you have pallets, use them. I'm a big scrapper, so use whatever you got. I use rough cut lumber. It's just anything you can cut into the right dimensions, right? Which is, you need to make a 1 3/8 inch by 9 inch by 3/4 inch piece, and you need a whole lot of them. Right? You basically need 2 of them for every frame holder, so you need 70 of them, right? So if you think about what that means in terms of making it, it's running those through a table saw and then chop, 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 right? So straight cuts, straight cuts. I wanted to make it so that it didn't need like special jigs and special tools. Like, the boxes, you really have to reinforce those corners. Really, otherwise they're going to come apart on you. So this is, you just need like a drill screwdriver kind of thing, and I think it'd be, a table saw is great. If you have a table saw, that's great. You can do it with a circular saw, but a table saw is really honestly what you need. And
Do you have anything? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
Do you have anything, Jonathan?
You mentioned the lid being like say a quarter sheet of plywood or something like that. What's the weight on the lid on it, do you think?
Yeah, the lid is. Yeah, it's probably 50. I don't know. I don't know because in the new design, I've got it so it hinges up.
Mm-hmm.
I was working with the high school here, the local high school, and getting them one, and I didn't want them to have to lift the um, lid off, which is what
Mm-hmm.
I do on mine. So it hinges up. So I don't know what that weight is. That's a really good question. I can find out for you and get it back to you, but I don't know
Yeah.
what that takes.
Is that your newer design? It's more of a long
No,
tilted hive.
no, that's a completely separate hive.
Mm-hmm.
So the Parkinson hive that we've been talking about is a stair step thing
Mm-hmm.
with a lid that hinges up, and the purpose of the lid is to just keep rain and wind and snow and stuff off of the actual inner covers. That's really the only purpose of the lid. It doesn't do much other than that. Um, and then there's insulator hives in the back that uh, absorb moisture and keep cold breezes out and stuff like that. But that's the Parkinson hive, and like I said, if mobility is not an issue, I consider that a hive that I can hand to anybody, hand them a checklist, and they'll have success, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which was kind of the goal. Now, when you get into limited mobility, one of the things that I wanted to do was say, okay, what can we do with a traditional long length stroth, right? And like I said, those problems that I mentioned before about the bees not knowing which way to go, or the cluster moving up and then not knowing which way to go when they get to the top, and then the moisture going up and forming a cloud. Well, I was thinking about all the clever ways to deal with this, and I thought, you know what would happen if we just took a standard long length stroth, which is basically a coffin, right, with
Mm-hmm.
with frames in it, and just tilted it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we tilted it 60 degrees. So there's nothing special about this other than a tilt.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to do a couple things to see if they'd work. I'm not sure if they work, but if you just take a standard long Langstroth, tilted it, whatever, come on, like 60 degrees, then you use standard frames in there. You've solved a lot of the problems with a long Langstroth in a cold climate and a
Mm-hmm.
really warm climate, because that hot bee breath goes up to a point and it condenses and runs down the sides instead of going up to a flat surface where it forms a cloud and condenses and drops right down through. That's one of the key differences. And actually, I get what started me thinking about that was one of the tricks that people have tried up here is in the winter, you take your standard long Langstroth and you put a brick underneath the back left leg. Let's say the bees work from right to left. You put a brick underneath the back left leg, and then 2x4s underneath the front left and the back right. And so your hive is kind of tilted at an angle, just a little bit of an angle like that. Well,
Mm-hmm.
what that does is it moves the moisture. It allows that moisture to move a little bit. It gives the bees a little bit of direction that says, hey, your honey's over this way, right? So when they expand and break, they're going to expand and kind of go to the upside, wherever up is. They're going to go up, and that gives them a sense of up. So by tilting the hive, well, there are a couple of things that happen. That moisture gets under control, but the other thing that's really important is that you've got that cluster. Let's say its cluster is this big. Your frame is only just an inch bigger if it's a traditional long Langstroth. By tilting that frame, you go from 9 inches of vertical space to 19, right? So
Mm-hmm.
now when your protracted cold spell happens, they've got over 100% more room to go up, right? And that gives them the opportunity to go up, and hopefully a warmer day comes and they can spread out and go, okay, this is where I need to go, left or right, right? And you still have the issue of tilt up one side or tilt, so they know which way to go. But it solves that problem. So that was the initial thought, was to solve those two problems. But then the other thing that I didn't expect, totally caught me by surprise, completely, totally caught me by surprise, was when I went to inspect that, what a difference. What a difference that makes to not lean over the bees and have your arm sticking out here trying to crack that frame off, on the opposite side of you.
Mm-hmm.
Here it's like a bookshelf. You're right up next to it. You just kind of crack the top open and just slide them right out like a bookshelf. And so in terms of accessibility, it's way better than anything, you know, like every other hive I've ever worked with. It's a lot better than any other hive I've worked with. So for anybody with disabilities or anything like that that has any physical limitations, boy, I just strongly recommend that, because it's so easy to get those things in and out. And I'm going to change the top design to give a little working shelf. Somebody gave me that idea. Right now the top lifts up, which you know, I wasn't thinking this through, which that's what happens. So I'm gonna have a two-piece top. Where's my hands? Boy, this is the hardest thing I've done today. Anyway, two-piece top that tilts down and then over, so that basically you get a little shelf looking like this. Boy, looking like that. So that you have a working shelf, right? So even if you're there with one arm, right, you can crack that open, slide it out, put it on that shelf, and work it. And you know what a big advantage that is compared to other things. And because the hive is at an angle like this, when that shelf is going to be here on this side, you set that frame up there and it just leans up against the rest of the frames. It'll be a really, really nice thing. So I think in terms of accessibility, that hive is superior to anything else that's out there, just far and away. And again, there's build videos out there how I built it, but you can take any long Langstroth and just tilt it.
So how many of these hives do you have that you're keeping bees in, and what's your survivability during the winter?
Yeah, so I have 2 hives here. There's some at the school. I've got some others around. And survivability is one of those things, gosh, okay. And I made a video about this because when I'm not testing anything, they survive. That's the easy way to say it. And there are some unexpected things, and I've made a video coming out with this tilted hive. And breaking here first on the Accessible Beekeeping podcast, I'm going to reveal some things that I found out over winter, because what I wanted to do this winter, the test that I really wanted to do, was to validate that the cluster was here and that they had plenty of room to move up that frame, and then that they would expand and contract and move sideways toward the honey. That was the test I wanted to do. I didn't feed them last fall. I was purposely going to run them out of food. And the reason for that is that I wanted them to move, right? And say they starved, they used up every bit of food. They found every bit of food in that hive. They were able to get to it. I didn't want them to run out of food. Let me rephrase it. I wanted them to run almost out of food. But then as our spring turned into the, you know, one of the terrible springs that we have here, it's like, oh man, they're absolutely going to run out of food. And so I was expecting that as a result. I was wrong. I'm always wrong. So I got in there and they had moved up the frame and proven out that was really good. That extra space of having the frame at an angle like that, gosh darn it, at an angle like that, having the frame at an angle like that gives them a lot more space to go up. So they would have run out of room on a standard frame sitting in there, you know, horizontally. They would have gone up to the top. So they went above that, and that was fine. There's either, depending on the size of the cluster, there's evidence that they moved side to side, or that I had a big cluster in there that shrunk. Okay. Now I assumed that because I didn't insulate the hive, I wanted to see how that was going to work. That the cold had nibbled away at the bees, and basically the cluster shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and you know, died over the winter here. Based on how far they made it, I know they made it through the coldest part of the Wisconsin winter. I know they made it into spring. The queen was laying. There's brood in there, so they got to that point, but they died. And the thing that was the sucker punch and the really difficult part for me to swallow is that they died from mites, of all things. And I had done a mite count last fall, and I had done a mite treatment last fall. And you know, they didn't have one of my hives had one. That was the mite count, one, and the other one had like 4, I think. And I didn't want mites to be an issue for this test, so I did the mite treatment. What I did for mite treatment was the formic acid strips. You guys familiar with those?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, but the hive's at an angle, right? Okay, I'll figure this camera thing out. The hive's at an angle, and I put the formic acid strips here and here over the brood. Just boom, boom, like that, right? Because you have to put them somewhere. And I didn't think about it, but the entrance is down here. Where's the entrance? Right there. And so the air circulation comes in and goes out the top. And so I think what happened is that formic acid, those formic acid vapors, most of them were just pushed right out the top and didn't settle down into the brood. Because if you have a Langstroth, and I talk about this in the video that's coming tonight after this podcast on purpose. If you have a Langstroth and you've got your frames like this and you lay your formic acid, one of the coolest things you can do with a Langstroth, and you've got the full entrance along there, is you get your smoker going and you get that little waft of smoke where it's, you know, just like a I Dream of Jeannie thing coming right out of there, just real gentle. On a day with absolutely no wind, not a breath of wind anywhere, go down to your Langstroth hive and just hold your smoker by the entrance and watch what that smoke does. It'll either drift into the hive or out of the hive. Then put it on the other side of that entrance and it'll do the opposite. So the bees have this natural thing where the air goes in one side of the hive and comes out the other side, or one side of the entrance and comes out the other side of the entrance. Now, when you think about that with those formic acid strips, it's basically washing the whole hive. It comes up one side, takes the formic acid vapors, washes it, I think anyway, and then it comes down the other side and gets more, and it's basically has that circulation in there. This hive at an angle, wherever the angle is, jeez. Come on. This hive at the angle, I'll just use one arm. This hive at the angle has the air circulation going one direction, up and out.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the thing there is that, so what I learned is that even if you do a mite treatment, the placement of those formic acid strips in this hive, what I did doesn't work. Right? And so had I done something like oxalic acid, where you put the vaporizer in the hole and, you know, blow a bunch of stuff in there, done that type of treatment cycles, 3 cycles of that, then it would have been a much more effective mite treatment, I think. But the interesting thing is that I had like 4 as my mite count. And then when I did the dead out mite count, it was 15 or something like that, which is a lot. For me anyway, that's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means, to me, that either my mite count was completely off in the fall and there was a really high mite count and I just got bees that weren't by the brood or something like that, or that formic acid just didn't work. And while it could have been defective formic acid, I don't think so. I think it's that the airflow of the hive. So I have to think about that, and I've got some tests to do. But yeah, so overwintering, the 4 things: freeze. Are they going to freeze? Do they have enough food? Did you control your mites? Right. So what was the 4th one? Freeze, food. Yeah. And moisture. So if you control the moisture, where the moisture condenses.
Mm-hmm.
So the Parkinson Hive, yeah, they overwinter there, and I've had some design changes because of how breezes get in and different things over the years. But yeah, the last few they go over the winter, and then this is the first time with that Langstroth at an angle, and it was the mites that got them, which somebody suggested on YouTube. I'm like, it's not the mites. Come on, I'm not an amateur. It was the mites.
Mm-hmm. So what's your theory on them strips? Can you put them down deeper in the box and maybe have better circulation, or what do you think is going to improve there?
Yeah, I don't know what the answer there is. What I was going to do is a couple of tests with just little smoke and wallpaper steamers type things to see how that moves and whether it's as simple as putting the strips on the bottom of the frame
Mm-hmm.
instead, or if you have to do something else. I don't know. I don't really know at this point, but I'm going to find out where to put them. But right now, and in the video that's dropping, I'm just saying, just use the oxalic acid you know, and vaporizer for now for mite treatment.
You have a second hive called the Extreme Climate Hive.
Yeah, that's the one we're talking about. That's basically the long length drop that's tilted at an angle. I just called it the Extreme.
Okay. Awesome. We're actually running out of time. You gave us so much good information.
Yeah.
What YouTube channel can they go to watch the video on the Extreme Climate Hive?
Yeah, so there are there's a Facebook group called Parkinson Hive. There's a YouTube channel called Parkinson Hive, and you know they're out there. There's also, and this is my thing, there's a book out on Amazon, and the reason the book is out on Amazon, if you read the first page, it says you can download this for free at this site. And the reason I put it out there is because I didn't want people going to Amazon, or if people were searching beehives on Amazon, I wanted them to find it and still be able to get it, but not have to pay $4.99.
Have to pay for it, yeah.
Yeah. So but still, some people buy it, like not a lot, but a couple, and it's like, geez, it's not even formatted. Sorry. So I told him, I was talking to my wife about that today. I'm like, we really ought to format that better if people are actually paying money for it. So, but yeah, there's the Facebook group, Parkinson Hive, and also the YouTube channel is, I believe, Parkinson Hive.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Make sure you join Dwayne Parkinson's Facebook group, which he just said was Parkinson Hive. Go follow him on YouTube at the same handle, and we appreciate you being on.
Yeah, it was good to be here. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Later, guys.